Hello, friends. Tonight we're traveling back in time, but not to the shiny parts you see in movies. No castles gleaming in the sunset. No knights in armor so polished you could use it as a mirror. We're going to the places Google Maps would show as no results found, and where Uber Eats has definitely never delivered. We're talking about medieval peasants, the people who didn't ride horses or wear crowns, who never had their portraits painted or their deeds recorded. The ones who survived plagues, famines, taxes, and 100 small daily humiliations, all without a single Instagram story to document their struggles. If there had been Yelp reviews for medieval peasant life, they would have averaged about 1 star, with comments like terrible service, bland food, high mortality rate, would not recommend. And yet somehow, these people not only survived, but managed to find moments of joy in a world that seemed designed to crush them. Tonight, we're not just visiting medieval Europe. We're taking a gentle journey across the medieval world, because as it turns out, the experience of working incredibly hard while someone else gets rich was surprisingly universal. Whether you were a peasant in England wondering why your lord needed 3 hunting dogs when you had 0 dinner, or a farmer in China calculating how much rice to give the local official while your children went hungry. The basic math of medieval life was remarkably consistent across continents. The math was simple: you worked, they benefited. You hoped tomorrow would be slightly less terrible than today. But here's the thing that might surprise you. These weren't broken people. They weren't just victims waiting around to be rescued by the Renaissance. They were resourceful, funny, stubborn, loving human beings who figured out how to build lives worth living, even when the odds were stacked against them, like a very unfair game of Jenga. They developed jokes that would make you laugh today. If you could understand their dialect, they fell in love. Even when love meant sharing the last piece of bread with someone, they raised children who somehow grew up to be functional adults, despite never seeing a vegetable that wasn't turnip-shaped. They created songs, stories, and traditions that survive longer than the kingdoms that tax them. And they mastered something we're still trying to figure out in our age of anxiety: how to find contentment in simplicity, how to sleep soundly when tomorrow is uncertain, how to appreciate small comforts when small comforts are all you have. So if this kind of quiet, slow history helps you unwind, feel free to settle in. Dim the lights, maybe turn on that fan for some white noise. We're going to explore a world where life was hard but not hopeless, where people found ways to laugh even when laughter seemed impossible. We'll visit villages that don't appear on any map, meet people whose names were never written down, and discover that the art of survival, true survival, with dignity intact and humor preserved, is actually quite remarkable. Tonight, we're honoring the unsung heroes of history, not the ones who conquered kingdoms, but the ones who conquered winter. Not the ones who built monuments, but the ones who built homes with their own hands and somehow made them feel like home. Not the ones who wrote epic poems, but the ones who lived epic lives, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. From England to Japan, from France to China, from the cold forests of Russia to the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, we'll discover that while the details varied, rice instead of wheat, silk instead of wool, different gods and different languages, the human experience of getting by, getting through, and getting up each morning has remained remarkably comfortingly familiar. These were people who understood something we sometimes forget: that survival itself can be a form of art, that endurance can be elegant, and that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply refuse to give up. So take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and prepare to meet some of the most quietly heroic people who ever lived. People who would probably find our problems amusing and our solutions unnecessarily complicated. People who knew that a warm fire, a full belly, and a peaceful night's sleep were achievements worth celebrating. People who, despite everything, somehow figured out how to sleep soundly under thatched roofs that leaked, in beds they shared with half their family and occasionally a goat. In a world that offered no guarantees except that tomorrow the sun would rise and there would be work to do. And perhaps most remarkably of all, They usually woke up grateful for another chance to try and Shuemu. Let's begin. The village, the nameless place. This village doesn't have a name, or if it did, no one bothers remembering it anymore. It exists in that sweet spot between the middle of nowhere and where even nowhere would feel overdeveloped. You'll find it nestled in a shallow valley, just far enough from any main road to avoid unwanted visitors, tax collectors, and people selling things you can't afford. It's the medieval equivalent of being unlisted in the phone book, except phone books won't be invented for another 600 years. And honestly, most people here wouldn't know what to do with literacy, even if it showed up wearing a name tag. Now, if you think only European peasants lived in places that cartographers forgot to mention, let me introduce you to a village on the other side of the world. Somewhere in what we now call China, there's another collection of humble dwellings where people wake up at dawn, work until dusk, and spend their evenings wondering if tomorrow's weather will cooperate. The main difference, they bow to rice fields instead of wheat, and their lord lives in a compound with curved roofs instead of a drafty stone tower. In Japan, there's a village where farmers worry about the same things. Will the harvest be enough? Will the tax collector be reasonable? Will anyone remember to fix the bridge before winter? But their tax collector carries a sword and has opinions about honor, which adds a certain dramatic flair to the whole "we can't pay this year" conversation. The point is, the art of living quietly while hoping for the best was apparently a universal human skill, transcending language barriers and continental divides. But back to our European village. Population, however many people can fit into a dozen crooked houses without violating medieval fire codes, which is to say there are no fire codes. So the answer is all of them, plus their relatives, plus anyone who shows up claiming to be a relative. The houses clustered together like old friends sharing gossip, which, coincidentally, is exactly what their inhabitants spend most of their time doing. News travels faster than plague in a place this small, and considering how fast plague travels, that's saying something. There's usually someone designated as the village elder, though elder here means whoever lived long enough to develop strong opinions about everything. In our village, that's a man named Thomas, who once spoke to a traveling monk for 10 minutes and has been dining out on that conversation ever since. Thomas's qualifications for leadership include his house hasn't fallen down yet, his goat looks healthy, and he can remember which field belongs to whom without starting a fight. That's basically a medieval PhD in public administration. The village operates on what we might call aggressive cooperation. Everyone knows everyone else's business, which sounds intrusive until you realize it's actually a survival strategy. When your neighbor's roof starts leaking, it becomes everyone's problem, because a collapsed roof in a village this size affects property values, social dynamics, and the general feng shui of the entire settlement. Plus, if Thomas's house falls down, who's going to remember that conversation with the monk? Boundaries between properties exist in theory, defined by helpful landmarks like past the old elm tree, or where the ground gets marshy, or where old Margaret's chickens refuse to go. These boundaries are understood with the kind of precision that medieval surveying allows, which is to say, approximately correct unless someone's feeling argumentative. Disputes are handled through a sophisticated conflict resolution process. Someone brings up the problem. Everyone argues about it for exactly the right amount of time, not too short to seem dismissive, not too long to seem petty, and then someone's wife shows up with fresh bread and suddenly everyone remembers their neighbors. It's democracy in action. Medieval style. The village exists in a bubble of isolation that's both protective and limiting. It's far enough from major roads to avoid bandits, armies, and traveling salesmen, but close enough to, well, actually, it's not really close to anything useful. The nearest market town is a day's walk, which might as well be on the moon, considering how often most people make that journey. This isolation creates a unique social ecosystem. Strangers are so rare that their arrival becomes the entertainment for weeks. Where do they come from? What do they want? Are they carrying news, disease, or both? Do they know any good songs? Can they fix things? Should we be worried? The last stranger who passed through was a tinker 3 summers ago, and people are still discussing whether his pot repair techniques were legitimate or just clever-looking nonsense that would fall apart come winter. For most villagers, the world effectively ends where the forest begins. Those trees represent the boundary between here and there, between the known and the unknowable. Beyond them lie other villages, possibly containing people who do things slightly differently, which is both fascinating and mildly threatening. Some villagers have heard rumors of towns, those legendary places where buildings are made of stone and reach impossible heights of 2, even 3 stories, where people buy things instead of making them, where strangers walk around like it's normal, where someone can make a living doing just one thing all day instead of 17 different things badly. These tales are received with the same mixture of wonder and skepticism that we might reserve for stories about dragons or honest politicians. Children grow up knowing every rock, tree, and mud puddle within walking distance. They can tell you which path to take to avoid the swampy bit, where the best berries grow, and which neighbor's dog is all bark and no bite spoiler. It's all of them, because no one can afford to feed a dog enough to make it genuinely threatening. This intimate knowledge of place creates a deep sense of belonging, even when that place is objectively a muddy collection of leaky houses surrounded by stubborn soil and unpredictable weather. It's theirs. They built it. They know it. They've earned every splinter and drafty corner. And in the evenings, when the work is done and the animals are settled, when the cooking fires cast warm light through small windows and the village settles into its nightly rhythm of quiet conversations and comfortable silences, there's something almost magical about this small, forgotten place. Not because it's paradise, it's not, but because it's home to people who figured out how to make a community work with nothing but stubbornness, humor, and the shared understanding that tomorrow will probably be difficult, but at least they'll face it together. The village may not have a name worth remembering, but it has something better people worth knowing, even if you'll never know their names either. Home Sweet Hubble, the medieval dream house. Let's talk about medieval real estate. If there had been property listings back then, they would have read something like cozy one-room dwelling, rustic charm, all natural building materials, shared living concept, pet-friendly, some assembly required, roof warranty void during rainy seasons. Your medieval home isn't really a house in the way we think of houses today. It's more like a negotiated settlement between human ambition and the laws of physics. You're essentially asking mud, sticks, and hope to form a temporary alliance against wind, rain, and gravity. And honestly, the results are about what you'd expect. The architectural philosophy of the medieval peasant can be summed up in one simple principle. If it doesn't collapse during the first winter, we'll call it a success and throw a party. This was before building codes, before safety inspections, before anyone had strong opinions about load-bearing walls or proper foundation depth. You begin with a frame made from whatever trees were willing to sacrifice themselves for your housing dreams. The wood isn't straight because perfectly straight trees are apparently too good for peasant housing. And crooked trees have character. Character, in this context, means will definitely cause structural problems later. But we'll deal with that when we get there. Now, if you lived in medieval China, you'd be working with bamboo and doing essentially the same thing, but with materials that actually bend on purpose instead of by accident. Chinese peasant homes had the advantage of being built by people who'd been perfecting the art of making shelter from whatever's growing nearby for a few thousand years. In Japan, your medieval house would involve more wood, more precise joinery, and an aesthetic philosophy that somehow made poverty look elegant. Japanese peasants managed to create homes that were both humble and dignified, which is basically architectural magic. But back to our European hovel, where dignity is more of a happy accident than a design goal. After your questionably stretched frame is up, you begin the ancient art of wattle and daub. Wattle is just a fancy word for weaving sticks together like you're making the world's least comfortable basket. You take thin, flexible branches and weave them between the posts, creating a framework that looks like someone tried to knit a wall and gave up halfway through. Then comes the daub, a mixture of mud, straw, animal dung, and whatever else is lying around that might stick to things. You slap this mixture onto your woven sticks with all the precision and artistry of someone frosting a cake while blindfolded during an earthquake. The smell is distinctive. Imagine wet earth mixed with barnyard, with subtle notes of, we ran out of better options. Eventually, you stop noticing it, the same way you stop noticing that your back hurts or that your neighbor's rooster has opinions about sunrise timing. The daub dries slowly, cracking in the sun like dried mud, because that's essentially what it is. Pieces fall off regularly, which gives you something to do during the long winter months when you are not busy surviving. You just keep slapping more mud on the walls, like playing an extremely boring and practical game of whack-a-mole. Your roof is thatched, which sounds quaint and cottagecore until you actually have to live under it. Fresh thatch is golden and almost pretty, giving your home the appearance of being cosplayed by a haystack. But then weather happens. Rain turns your roof into a soggy, slowly decomposing blanket that develops its own ecosystem. Birds move in without asking permission and seem surprised when you object to sharing your living space. Small animals take up residence between the layers, creating a situation where your roof is simultaneously your shelter in a tiny apartment complex for creatures you never invited. The saying, "it's raining cats and mouse," probably came from medieval people whose roofs literally had cats and dogs living in them, and occasionally one would fall through during a storm. Holes appear in your thatch with the inevitability of taxes or death. You place buckets strategically around your single room, creating an indoor obstacle course that tests your memory and reflexes every time you get up in the dark. The buckets become part of the furniture, and you develop a strange affection for the rhythmic dripping that helps you fall asleep. Your floor is dirt. Not beautiful, artisanal dirt, just regular dirt that you've walked on enough times to compact it into something approaching flatness. You tell yourself it's packed earth flooring because that sounds more intentional, but really it's just the ground with a roof over it. When it rains, your floor becomes mud. When it freezes, it becomes a lumpy, uneven skating rink. When it's dry, it creates dust that settles on everything, including your food, your clothes, and your hopes for cleanliness. Sometimes you spread rushes or straw to cover the dirt, which helps until the straw gets damp, dirty, and starts to decompose into the floor, creating a layer of organic matter that archaeologists will someday find fascinating and you find slightly horrifying. Windows are technically openings in the wall that you can cover with wooden shutters when you remember to close them and when the shutters aren't busy warping, sticking, or falling off their hinges. Glass is for rich people in churches, not for folks who consider walls that stay up a luxury feature. This means your windows let in wind, rain, small animals, larger insects, and occasionally your neighbor's chickens, who have their own opinions about property boundaries. Inside your architectural achievement, space is what we might charitably call shared. One room for everything: sleeping, eating, cooking, arguing, making up, storing things, and hosting the occasional chicken who's gotten confused about where she lives. Everyone sleeps together, not out of choice, but out of thermal necessity. Privacy is a concept that won't be invented for several centuries, along with personal space and the radical idea that maybe parents and children don't need to hear each other's every conversation, dream, and digestive process. Your furniture consists of whatever you or your neighbors could make from leftover wood and unlimited optimism. A table that wobbles in interesting ways, benches that test your balance, stools that seem sturdy until you actually sit on them. Everything is slightly the wrong height because medieval people apparently had different ideas about ergonomics. Storage happens in the rafters, where you hang anything that needs to stay dry, stay safe, or stay away from the rats. Bundles of herbs, garlic, onions, and occasionally a ham if the pig was particularly generous that year, all swaying gently overhead like the world's most practical chandelier. The fireplace is the heart of your home, built of stone if you're lucky, clay if you're not, and desperate hope if you're really not. The smoke is supposed to go up through a hole in the roof, and mostly it does. Except when the wind changes direction and your house fills with smoke like you're living inside a campfire. But here's the remarkable thing about these impossible homes: they work. Not perfectly, not comfortably, not in any way that would satisfy a modern building inspector, but they work. They keep families together, they keep the worst of the weather out, and they somehow manage to feel like home. Because home isn't about perfect construction or ideal conditions. It's about the people who share the space, who patch the walls together, who take turns feeding the fire, who laugh about the bucket placement and make jokes about the roof's latest residents. It's about falling asleep to familiar sounds, the crackle of coals, the gentle snoring of your family, the occasional bleat from the goat in the corner, and waking up grateful that everything is still standing and no one fell through the floor during the night. Your medieval home may not be much, but it's yours. You built it with your own hands. You know every leak and creak and crack, and somehow, surrounded by the people you love and the animals you tolerate, it manages to feel like the center of the universe, even when the universe smells faintly of wet thatch and confused chickens. Food. Medieval culinary adventures. Let's talk about medieval cuisine, a topic that would make Gordon Ramsay weep, and not tears of joy. If medieval peasants had written restaurant reviews, they would have been very short. Food existed. We ate it, still alive. 4 stars. The cornerstone of medieval dining was a dish called pottage, which could be considered the distant ancestor of instant ramen. The key difference being that instant ramen cooks in 3 minutes, while pottage never really finished cooking. It just existed in a permanent state of warm enough not to kill you and chewy enough to count as exercise. Pottage was less a recipe than a philosophical statement about making the best of what you have. You started with a pot, ideally one without holes, but medieval peasants weren't picky. You added water, which hopefully came from a source that hadn't recently hosted any deceased livestock. Then you threw in whatever edible substances you could find, stirred them together and hoped for the best. The ingredients varied depending on what was available, which season it was, and how desperate you were feeling. On a good day, pottage might include cabbage, leeks, barley, and maybe some legumes that hadn't yet achieved sentience. If you were feeling fancy, you might add garlic or onions, which were the medieval equivalent of truffle oil. A little bit made everything seem more sophisticated. In winter, you used dried beans or peas, which had the texture of small rocks and were roughly the same flavor profile. If you were extraordinarily lucky, you might find a scrap of salted pork to add, though more often it was just the bone, which you'd boil hopefully until it remembered what meat tasted like. The flavor was consistent across seasons: earthy, gray, and more about temperature than actual taste. You didn't eat pottage for pleasure. You ate it because it was warm, filling, and unlikely to poison you, which were basically the 3 pillars of medieval food safety. Now, if you were a peasant in medieval China, your daily meal looked similar but tasted completely different. Instead of pottage, you had congee, rice porridge that could be stretched with water when times were hard and enhanced with vegetables when times were slightly less hard. Chinese peasants had mastered the art of making a little rice go a very long way, adding pickled vegetables, bean sprouts, or whatever greens could be foraged from the countryside. Japanese peasants lived on rice and miso soup, occasionally enhanced with whatever vegetables they could grow in their small plots. They had developed an aesthetic philosophy around simple food that somehow made poverty look elegant, which is a cultural superpower that European peasants definitely lacked. But regardless of continent, the universal peasant experience was learning to make almost nothing taste like something worth eating, which is basically culinary alchemy. The pot itself never really got clean. You wiped it out, maybe scraped it if you were feeling ambitious. But truly cleaning it would have meant losing all the accumulated flavors from previous meals. Each new batch of pottage inherited the ghost of every pottage that came before it, creating a kind of culinary archaeology where dinner tonight carried traces of dinner from 3 months ago. Bread was the other staple. Though calling it bread required a generous interpretation of what bread could be, medieval peasant bread was dense, dark, and had the structural integrity of a small building. It was made from whatever grain was available, barley, rye, oats, anything except wheat, which was reserved for people who didn't have to grow their own food. The loaves were small, heavy, and remarkably durable. If you dropped one, you checked the floor for damage, not the bread. Day-old bread could probably be used as a hammer, and week-old bread definitely could. There are unconfirmed reports of medieval bread being used in construction projects, though this might be exaggeration. Sometimes, when regular flour was scarce, people got creative with their ingredients. They ground up peas, added chaff, or even included tree bark, not as a delicious flavor enhancer, but because bark contains nutrients and was technically edible if you were desperate enough. This created what was charitably called famine bread, which tasted about as good as it sounds, but had the advantage of keeping you alive. During really hard times, people used trenchers, thick slices of old bread that served as plates. You'd pile your food on top, eat the food, and then either eat the bread plate or give it to someone lower in the social hierarchy. It was an early form of edible packaging, though probably not as appetizing as modern edible arrangements. Protein was about as rare as honest tax collectors. Your chickens were too valuable for their eggs to be casually murdered for dinner. Your cow was too precious for her milk to be turned into a one-time meal. You didn't eat your livestock unless you had absolutely no choice, because eating your source of future food was the medieval equivalent of spending your retirement savings on lottery tickets. When you did get meat, you used every single part of the animal, partly out of respect and mostly out of necessity. The meat, fat, organs, bones, blood, everything had a purpose. Blood became puddings. Fat was rendered for cooking and light. Bones were boiled until they gave up every last nutrient they contained. Pork was the most common meat when it was available. Pigs were efficient converters of scraps into protein, and unlike cows or sheep, they didn't have secondary jobs like providing milk or wool. When a pig was slaughtered, it became an event requiring careful planning, salt for preservation, and probably a small celebration because everyone was about to eat something other than pottage for a few days. The salting and smoking process meant that a single pig could provide flavoring for months of meals, even if actual chunks of meat were doled out sparingly. A piece of bacon fat could make a pot of beans taste like a feast, which explains why medieval people got so excited about pork. Fishing was an option if you lived near water, and if that water wasn't owned by someone with strong opinions about who was allowed to catch what. Many rivers and lakes belonged to the local lord, and fishing without permission could result in fines, punishment, or awkward conversations with armed men who lacked a sense of humor about property rights. When fishing was allowed, people caught whatever was available: eels, small river fish, anything that wouldn't immediately spoil. Salted herring, when it could be obtained, was treated like treasure because it provided protein that could last through winter without requiring refrigeration, which hadn't been invented yet. The church added its own complications to medieval dining through an elaborate schedule of fasting and feasting. Fridays were meatless. Lent was basically 40 days of pretending fish counted as a complete meal, and various saints' days required specific dietary observances that seemed designed to test both faith and creativity. In a theological masterstroke that would make modern lawyers proud, beaver tail was classified as fish because beavers lived in water. This allowed people to eat beaver during Lent, though one suspects that beaver tail was more about technical compliance than culinary pleasure. Dairy products existed in a constant race against spoilage. Milk had to be used quickly or converted into cheese or butter before it went bad, which in a world without refrigeration meant before tomorrow, probably tuck. Butter was a luxury that had to be used sparingly. Cheese was often hard and tangy and occasionally moldy. But you just cut around the worst bits and hoped your stomach was stronger than whatever was growing on the surface. Drinks were surprisingly varied, mainly because water was often unsafe and everyone knew it, even if they didn't understand why. Small beer, weak ale with just enough alcohol to kill bacteria, was the default beverage for everyone, including children. It wasn't about getting drunk, it was about staying alive. If you had access to apples or pears, you might make cider. Wine was generally reserved for clergy and nobility, though peasants occasionally got some during religious festivals. Mead was rare and special. Milk was mainly for children and the sick, and water was approached with the caution of someone who'd learned from experience that clear didn't necessarily mean safe. Vegetables formed the foundation of the peasant diet, though the selection would seem limited by modern standards. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks, and carrots, though medieval carrots were white or purple, not the orange ones we know today. These were grown in small garden plots and used completely, from root to leaf, because waste wasn't an option when survival was uncertain. Fruit was seasonal and precious. Apples were the most common, along with whatever berries or wild plums could be found. If you could dry them, they might last through winter. Otherwise, they were eaten immediately and gratefully. Preserving was difficult without sugar, which was impossibly expensive, though honey from beehives provided occasional sweetness for those lucky enough to have bees. Herbs were grown when possible: parsley, dill, mint, though they were used more for medicine and tradition than flavor. Some herbs were believed to protect against illness, others kept pests away, and occasionally they even made food taste better, though that was generally considered a happy bonus rather than the main purpose. Meals were communal affairs eaten around the fire, with everyone sharing from the same pot and the same loaf. There were no courses, no elaborate presentations, just food that was warm, filling, and safe. You didn't complain about the flavor because complaining didn't make the pottage thicker or the bread softer. But on special occasions, weddings, harvest festivals, saints' days, there might be something approaching a feast: a roasted bird if someone had been lucky hunting, a pie made from hard pastry designed to hold rather than delight, maybe even spices if someone had traded well recently. Most days weren't feast days, though. Most days were quiet, simple, and repetitive. You ate what was available, you were grateful for warmth and sustenance, and you went to bed with the knowledge that tomorrow would probably taste very much like today. And somehow, in that simplicity, in that gratitude for basic nourishment, there was a kind of contentment that our age of infinite food choices might find hard to understand but easy to envy. Work and feudalism, the original subscription service. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't own much. You might have a patch of land, a few tools, a couple of animals, and a house you built with your own hands. But here's the catch: none of it was technically yours. It all belonged to your lord, not a king, not some distant mythical figure, just your local landlord who lived up the hill in a house that was slightly less likely to collapse and probably had a roof that didn't double as a bird sanctuary. Welcome to feudalism, the world's first subscription service. You got access to land, protection, and the privilege of existing, and in return, you paid with labor, goods, and a level of deference that would make modern customer service representatives weep with envy. You were what was called a villain. And no, that's not an insult, though it certainly felt like one. It was a job category, like accountant or influencer, except your job was person who works land they don't own while owing everything to someone they rarely see. You weren't a slave, but you weren't exactly free either. You existed in that special medieval category of, it's complicated. The relationship status with your lord was definitely, it's complicated. You couldn't leave without permission, couldn't pass on your land freely, and owed labor, goods, and the kind of respectful head nodding that suggested you understood exactly where you stood in the cosmic order of things. Now, if you think this system was uniquely European, let me introduce you to the rest of the medieval world, where apparently working really hard for someone else's benefit was the global hobby of choice. In medieval Japan, peasants had a relationship with samurai that was remarkably similar, except the samurai carried swords and had strong opinions about honor, which added a certain dramatic flair to conversations about late tax payments. Japanese peasants worked rice fields they didn't own, paid taxes in rice, and owed labor service, just like their European counterparts. The main difference was that their overlords could kill them legally and artistically. Chinese peasants dealt with local officials who collected taxes for the emperor, a figure so distant he might as well have been mythical. They worked land they didn't own, paid taxes in grain, and provided labor for public works projects like building walls to keep out nomads who also wanted to tax them. It was taxation with representation, where the representation was someone with a bigger army gets to make the decisions. Russian peasants had their own version called serfdom, which was like feudalism but with more snow and less pretense about protection. They were bound to the land so thoroughly that they were sometimes sold along with it, like particularly valuable livestock that could also thatch roofs. The universal constant across all these systems was the basic math you worked. They benefited, and everyone pretended this was the natural order of things. Your relationship with your Lord wasn't built on personal friendship or mutual respect. It was built on obligation, which was like friendship except one-sided and legally enforceable. You didn't have heart-to-heart conversations with him about your hopes and dreams. You talked to his steward, a man whose job was to remember what everyone owed and to look disappointed when they couldn't pay it. The steward was basically a medieval middle manager, equipped with ledgers, a permanent frown, and the social skills of someone whose job required him to extract resources from people who barely had resources to extract. He knew how much grain you owed, how many eggs you'd promised, and whether your son had reached the age where he could be added to the labor roster. Let's talk about corvée labor, which was a fancy French term for free work for the boss. A few days a week, sometimes more during harvest season, you were expected to drop whatever you were doing for your own survival and work the Lord's fields instead. This was presented as your contribution to the community, like volunteering at a charity event. Except the charity was making rich people richer, and volunteering was mandatory. You got nothing for this labor. No payment, no thanks, no employee of the month parking spot. Just the knowledge that somewhere in the manor house, someone was eating better food because of your unpaid overtime. The taxation system was impressively comprehensive. They had figured out how to tax everything you produced, owned, or might theoretically produce in the future. A portion of your grain, a share of your wool, some chickens here, eggs there. If you brewed ale, you owed ale. Now, if you had a pig, you owed bacon. If you managed to catch fish, surprise, someone else owned the river. But the creativity didn't stop with agricultural products. If you used the mill to grind your grain, and the mill was the only way to grind grain, you paid a fee. Even though the Lord owned the mill, set the prices, and probably hadn't maintained it since the previous Lord died, you might be tempted to grind grain by hand at home, but that was often illegal, punishable by fines or having your hand grinding equipment confiscated. Because the Lord didn't just want his share, he wanted control over how you got his share. The same applied to the communal oven. Many manors had one large oven that everyone was required to use for baking, for a fee, of course. If you tried to bake bread at home and got caught, you could face penalties. The system was designed to ensure that every basic necessity passed through a toll booth on its way to your table. Then there were the life cycle fees, which were basically charges for existing. Want to get married? That'll be a fee. Please. Want to inherit your father's plot of land? There's a fee for that too. Want to move to another village? First, ask permission, then pay a fee. Want to have children? Well, they couldn't directly charge for that, but they'd figure out how to tax the children eventually. Your livestock was taxed, your tools were sometimes taxed, and your ability to make major life decisions without paying someone for the privilege was essentially non-existent. So what did you get in return for this comprehensive subscription service? Well, the Lord was supposed to protect you, in theory, if bandits attacked or if a rival noble decided your village looked like easy pickings. The Lord had men-at-arms who could fight back. This protection was real, though it sometimes felt like paying protection money to avoid being robbed by the same people who were supposed to protect you from robbery. If famine struck, the Lord might distribute grain from his stores, though this was usually a loan rather than charity. And loans in medieval times came with the kind of interest rates that would make modern credit card companies blush. And if you had a legal dispute, say your neighbor's goat kept wandering into your garden and eating your turnips, the Lord's court might settle it. Again, not for free, because justice was another service that required payment, like Netflix, but for resolving property disputes. This was feudalism, a system of mutual obligations wrapped in the language of loyalty and protection, but functioning more like an elaborate pyramid scheme where the person at the top owned everything and everyone else owed them for the privilege of existing on their property. The manor house stood apart from the village, often literally on higher ground because symbolism mattered even in an age when most people couldn't read. It might be made of stone rather than mud and sticks, with a roof so well thatched that rain was just a theoretical concern rather than a nightly bucket placement puzzle. Inside were tapestries, proper furniture, servants, and the Lord himself, wearing clothes made from wool so fine it had probably never seen a sheep, eating meals that contained actual meat on a regular basis, and thinking about peasants mainly in terms of numbers: how much grain, how many eggs, whether the harvest would support his lifestyle and his tax obligations to his own lord. Because here's the thing about feudalism, it was a pyramid scheme. And unless you were at the very top, you were probably owing someone something while being owed something by someone else. Your lord had his own lord, who had his own obligations, stretching all the way up to kings who spent their time figuring out how to extract resources from their nobles who extracted resources from their peasants. Everything was recorded, not by you, literacy being a luxury you couldn't afford, but by clerks and stewards with their wax tablets and scraps of parchment, asking questions you learned to answer very carefully. Too much detail might reveal that you'd hidden some grain. Too little might make them suspicious. The art of talking to tax collectors became a survival skill passed down through generations. And if you didn't meet your obligations, well, there were consequences. Fines, usually paid in more goods you couldn't afford to lose. Additional labor duties. In extreme cases, your tools could be confiscated, your land reclaimed, or your family evicted from the only home you'd ever known. You didn't resist this system, not because you were weak or cowardly, but because resistance was mathematically impractical. The Lord had soldiers, resources, and legal authority. You had a farming implement and the kind of righteous anger that doesn't stop arrows. But here's the strange thing about feudalism: it worked. Not because it was fair or kind or anything approaching equitable, but because it was predictable. It had rules, harsh but consistent. You knew what you owed, you knew what was expected, and you knew what would happen if you failed to meet your obligations. There was a certain stability in that predictability, even when the stability came at the cost of justice. You could plan around injustice if it was reliable injustice. And occasionally, just occasionally it's done, the Lord would give something back. A feast day where food was distributed to the village. A holiday where labor duties were waived. A kind word spoken from horseback. Or a decision in your favor when you had a dispute with a neighbor. Not enough to balance the scales, but enough to keep the system from tipping into open revolt. Enough to maintain the fiction that this was a relationship rather than organized theft with legal paperwork. The relationship was never friendly, but it was enduring. Your lord might be young or old, kind or cruel, present or absent, but he was always above you in the hierarchy. You bowed when he passed, removed your hat, used the proper forms of address, not because he deserved it, but because the alternative was trouble you couldn't afford. And maybe, deep down, because a small part of you still hoped that good behavior might be rewarded, that loyalty might be recognized, that someone might notice how hard you worked and decide you deserve better. It almost never happened. But hope was free, and in a world where everything else had a price, free was a luxury worth preserving. Meanwhile, the steward kept walking through the village with his ledgers. The mill kept grinding grain for a fee, the oven kept baking bread for a price, and you kept working land that would never be yours. Year after year, season after season. There was no retirement plan, no upward mobility, no employee benefits beyond the right to keep existing, just the quiet knowledge that you had fulfilled your role in the great machine of medieval society. You had done what was asked of you, paid what was owed, and somehow made it through another year under the weight of someone else's authority. And as long as the Lord was satisfied with your contributions, you were allowed to continue the ancient peasant tradition of working incredibly hard while someone else got rich. It wasn't much of a deal, but it was the only deal available. And somehow, people found ways to build lives, raise families, and discover happiness within its constraints. Because the human capacity for finding joy in small spaces, for creating meaning within unfair systems, for building community despite exploitation, turned out to be stronger than any feudal contract. Even when the contract was written in someone else's favor and enforced by someone else's army. Health and medicine, the art of medieval survival. Let's talk about medieval healthcare, a topic that would make modern doctors either laugh hysterically or weep uncontrollably, depending on their sense of humor about professional history. If medieval medicine had a motto, it would be, first, do some harm, then see what happens. The medical philosophy of the Middle Ages can be summarized in one simple diagnostic tree. What seems to be the problem? Okay, let's try bleeding you. Still have the problem? Let's try more bleeding. Dead. Well, at least you're not complaining about the original problem anymore. Medieval people didn't understand what caused disease, which is understandable because germs are invisible and microscopes wouldn't be invented for several centuries. What they had instead were theories. Creative, confident, and spectacularly wrong theories that somehow managed to make sick people feel worse while making healthy people feel terrified. The leading medical theory was something called miasma, the belief that disease traveled through bad air, specifically air that smelled terrible. This wasn't entirely wrong, since places that smelled awful were often genuinely unhealthy, but the reasoning was like concluding that umbrellas cause rain because people carry them when it's raining. To combat bad air, people stuffed herbs into their clothing, carried flowers in their sleeves, or walked around with vinegar-soaked rags pressed to their faces. It was like wearing a face mask, except the mask was a bouquet and nobody understood why it might actually help. This was the medieval equivalent of essential oils, except with more desperation and less Instagram documentation. Another popular explanation for illness was divine punishment. If you got sick, it was probably because you'd sinned, thought impure thoughts, or failed to tithe enough to the church. This created a medical system where your doctor's first question wasn't where does it hurt, but what have you done wrong lately? And the prescribed treatment might involve confession, penance, and promising to be a better person if God would please make the fever stop. Some believed illness entered through the soles of your feet, which led to treatments involving boiling your feet or burning things near them. Others blamed the evil eye, a malevolent glare from someone jealous or angry. The cure for evil eye involved counter magic, protective amulets, and avoiding people who looked at you funny, which in a small village where everyone knew everyone's business was basically everyone. The actual treatments were as creative as the theories behind them. If you had a fever, the solution was bloodletting, a medical procedure that involved making you bleed on purpose because someone had decided you had too much blood, and that was why you felt bad. A local man would arrive with a blade, a bowl, and more confidence than actual training. Sometimes they used leeches, which sounds horrible until you realize that leeches actually produce anticoagulants and might have accidentally helped in some cases. Sometimes they used sharp stones or whatever cutting implement was handy. The theory was that illness was caused by an imbalance in your humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and bloodletting would restore the proper balance. Nobody had ever seen these humors, of course, but they were blamed for everything from headaches to heartbreak. It was like having an invisible IT department that you could blame for all your problems but couldn't actually communicate with. For swelling, there were poultices, pastes made from mashed herbs, mud, bread, or pretty much anything that could be smooshed into a paste and tied to your body with cloth. Some of these actually worked because certain herbs do have anti-inflammatory properties. Most didn't work, and a few made things worse. But the important thing was that something was being done. because doing nothing felt like giving up. If your stomach ached, you might chew on charcoal, which isn't entirely crazy since activated charcoal is still used for certain types of poisoning today. If you coughed blood, you might drink wine mixed with crushed pearls, which was expensive, ineffective, and probably tasted terrible, but demonstrated that someone cared enough about your health to waste valuable pearls on your lungs. For eye problems, someone might whisper prayers while blowing smoke over your head, combining medicine, religion, and amateur pyrotechnics into one comprehensive treatment. If your leg turned black, you were probably out of medical options. But someone might try tying a live chicken to the infected area and hoping the illness would transfer to the bird. It rarely worked, but it gave the chicken an interesting story to tell, assuming chickens could survive the experience. Medieval people were also big believers in amulets and protective charms. Bits of metal, bone, or stone worn around the neck, sometimes inscribed with protective words, sometimes blessed by a priest. Some people buried onions in the corners of their homes to ward off disease. Others hung garlic above doorways, which actually might have helped with some pests, though probably not for the reasons they thought. Now, it's tempting to laugh at all this medieval medical nonsense. But here's the thing, some of it actually worked. Not because they understood why it worked, but because trial and error over centuries had identified plants and treatments that genuinely helped people feel better. Willow bark for pain relief. They didn't know it contained the precursor to aspirin, but they knew it helped with headaches. Foxglove for heart problems, dangerous if you got the dosage wrong, but effective if you knew what you were doing. Honey for wound treatment. They didn't understand its antibacterial properties, but they knew it helped cuts heal faster. Many villages had a wise woman, usually an older woman who had accumulated decades of practical medical knowledge through experience, observation, and the kind of trial and error education you get when people keep bringing you their problems and expecting you to fix them. These women knew which herbs to boil for coughs, which ones to chew for stomach pain, and which ones to avoid unless you wanted to make your problems much worse. They understood childbirth, bone setting, wound care, and the art of making someone comfortable when there was nothing else to be done. They couldn't perform surgery or cure plague, but they could ease pain, reduce fever, and provide the kind of practical medical care that kept communities functional. In other parts of the world, medical knowledge was often more advanced. Chinese medicine had developed sophisticated theories about energy flow, herbal combinations, and diagnostic techniques that were actually quite effective. Islamic medical texts preserved and expanded on Greek and Roman knowledge, developing surgical techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge that wouldn't reach Europe for centuries. But regardless of the theoretical framework, the daily reality of medieval medicine was mostly about managing pain, treating symptoms, and helping people cope with illness rather than curing it. It was palliative care before anyone knew to call it that. When someone was seriously ill, the community gathered around them, not because there was much anyone could do medically, but because comfort mattered, presence mattered, and nobody should have to face sickness alone. They brought soup, they took turns sitting vigil, they shared stories and prayers and whatever hope they could manage. Death was a familiar presence, not feared exactly, but recognized and acknowledged. People knew when it was approaching, and they had rituals for easing the transition. There were prayers for the dying, ways of saying goodbye, methods of preparing both the dying person and their family for what was coming. Children grew up understanding that life was fragile, that health was temporary, and that taking care of each other was the most important medicine available. They learned which plants to avoid, which ones to gather, how to clean wounds, and how to sit quietly with someone who was suffering. They also learned that survival often came down to luck, stubbornness, and the kind of constitution that could outlast whatever was trying to kill you. Some people survived illnesses that should have been fatal, while others died from minor infections. There was no predicting it, no controlling it, just the daily practice of doing what you could and hoping for the best. And perhaps most remarkably, people found ways to laugh about their medical misadventures. They told stories about ridiculous treatments, compared scars, and developed a dark sense of humor about the various ways the human body could malfunction. Because if you can't laugh about the absurdity of trying to cure a fever by bleeding yourself while wearing a chicken around your neck, what can you laugh about? Medieval medicine was a combination of genuine knowledge, creative desperation, and the eternal human refusal to give up without a fight. It wasn't sophisticated, it wasn't always effective, but it was deeply human, the product of people who cared about each other enough to try anything that might help, even when they had no idea what they were doing. And sometimes, just sometimes, it worked. Not because of the theory behind it, but because caring for each other, refusing to abandon hope, and maintaining community in the face of suffering turned out to be medicine too. The kind that doesn't show up in medical textbooks, but might actually be the most important treatment of all. Religion, the ultimate subscription service. If you were a medieval peasant, the church wasn't just a place you visited on Sundays. It was basically the operating system for your entire existence. Imagine if Facebook, Google Calendar, Netflix, the IRS, and your local government all merged into one institution that also claimed to know what happened to you after you died. That was the medieval church, and opting out wasn't really an option. By the time you could walk, the church had already taken your name at baptism, blessed your breath with Latin you'd never understand, and stitched your soul into a system that extended far beyond your muddy little village. You belonged to the church not because you chose to, but because there literally wasn't another choice. It was like being born with a lifetime membership to a very demanding club that you could never cancel. The village priest was often the only person who could read, which made him part spiritual leader, part librarian, part customer service representative for God, and part local news anchor. He held the mysteries of the written word, the stories of the saints, and the answers to questions like, why did my pig die? And is this rash a sign of divine displeasure? He walked through the village like someone carrying both blessing and threat in his robes, because in many ways, that's exactly what he was doing. You brought your sins to him in whispers, hoping he wouldn't look too disappointed. You tried not to think about what he knew about everyone's private business, because confession was supposed to be confidential. But priests were still human and humans gossip. The centerpiece of religious life was the Latin Mass, and Latin might as well have been a programming language from the future. Nobody understood it except the priest, but everyone believed, or acted like they believed, that something important was happening when he mumbled those mysterious words over bread and wine. It was like watching someone perform technical magic. You didn't need to understand the code to believe the program was running. You stood in the cold church, feet numb, listening to words that never belonged to you, but somehow you felt connected to something larger than your daily struggle with leaky roofs and stubborn goats. The church had helpfully organized the entire year into sacred chunks: Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't say March or April. You said after Easter or near St. Michael's feast. The church calendar was like having a very religious scheduler who had strong opinions about when you could eat meat and when you needed to feel guilty about enjoying yourself. During Lent, you gave up meat for 40 days, which sounds like a modern diet trend, except it was mandatory and enforced by the threat of eternal damnation. During feast days, you were expected to celebrate, which was easier said than done when your idea of celebration was slightly more turnips in the soup tonight. But the church didn't just organize your time, it also took a substantial cut of your productivity. The tithe was 1/10 of everything you produced, and everything meant everything. Grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it came from your field or your body, God apparently wanted his share. Of course, God didn't actually collect it. The priest did, or the steward with his ledgers and his ability to count exactly how many eggs you owed. You gave because it was God's portion, which was brilliant marketing when you think about it. Who's going to argue with God about his tax rate? The tithe barn was always bigger than your house, which served as a constant reminder of who was really in charge of agricultural economics. Sometimes you could pay in candles or labor instead of food, which was helpful when your chickens weren't cooperating with the tithing schedule. Sometimes you couldn't pay at all, and the debt would accumulate like medieval student loans, growing heavier each season until it bent your back even when you stood upright. But the church wasn't just taking, it was also giving. Though not always in the way you might have preferred, it gave you stories, structure, and explanations for why terrible things happened to people who didn't deserve them. When your cow died for no reason, the priest could tell you which saint to pray to. When your child fell ill, he could explain whether it was a test, a punishment, or the devil slipping in through a crack in your faith. The saints were like a massive customer service department for the divine, with specialists for every possible problem. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Isidore for farming troubles, Saint Sebastian for plague protection. You didn't need to know their biographies or understand their qualifications. You just needed to know their names and what they could fix. Their stories were half memory, half legend, told by people who weren't entirely sure where history ended and hope began. You called on them when human solutions had been exhausted, whispering their names while stirring soup or kneeling in muddy fields, making deals with the dead in the hope that someone, somewhere, was still listening. If you were lucky enough to go on pilgrimage, it was both a spiritual journey and the medieval equivalent of vacation travel. For a few days or weeks, you stepped outside your 5-mile radius of existence and walked roads you'd never seen, towards shrines you'd only heard about in stories. You carried your prayers like luggage, slept under hedges, and arrived footsore and road-weary to stand before a bone or a statue and hope something would shift inside you. Sometimes it did. You returned not necessarily healed, but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you had been. The journey itself became part of the cure, the simple act of moving beyond the familiar boundaries of your daily suffering. Now, if you lived in medieval China, your spiritual life might revolve around Buddhism, Taoism, or Confucianism, each offering different explanations for suffering and different paths to peace. Chinese peasants burned incense, honored ancestors, and followed lunar calendars that organized their spiritual obligations differently, but just as thoroughly as Christian feast days. Japanese peasants might follow Buddhism or Shintoism, making offerings at shrines, participating in festivals, and maintaining relationships with spirits that lived in trees, rivers, and mountains. The specific beliefs varied, but the human need for spiritual structure, community ritual, and hope for something better than daily hardship remained remarkably consistent across cultures. Even death was choreographed by the church. When you felt the end approaching, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and words, touching your forehead, praying over your failing body, trying to ease your soul's transition from this world to whatever came next. Your family gathered, candles were lit, and if someone had the strength, the bell might ring to mark another departure. You were buried in sacred ground beside others who had walked the same difficult path. And then came the really expensive part, the masses for your soul. The church taught that death might not be the end of your troubles. You might spend years or centuries in purgatory, a kind of spiritual waiting room between suffering and salvation. Your family could help by paying for prayers, lighting candles, and keeping your name alive in the priest's daily recitations. The poor gave bread, the rich gave land, all to shorten a stay in a place nobody had seen but everyone feared. It was like paying for express shipping to heaven, except the delivery time was uncertain and customer satisfaction was difficult to verify. Fear was part of the church's gift to medieval life, but so was hope. The church explained why bad things happened to good people, why suffering was necessary, why obedience would be rewarded in the next life even if it wasn't rewarded in this one. It provided structure when everything else was chaos, certainty when everything else was uncertain. You never questioned the church's authority, not seriously, not out loud. You might grumble about the tithe or curse when the priest looked the other way during someone else's confession, but you kept showing up. You kept kneeling, kept crossing yourself when the bell rang, kept whispering prayers you'd learned before you could read. Because if the church wasn't right about everything, then the world had no shape at all, and a shapeless world was too terrifying to contemplate. Even for people who had learned to live with wolves, plague, and the annual possibility of starvation. The church offered something more precious than comfort. It offered meaning. It told you that your suffering mattered, that your endurance had purpose, that someone was keeping track of your struggles and would eventually balance the scales. Whether that was true or not, it was necessary. And in a world where necessity often trumped truth, the church provided the framework that allowed people to keep going, keep hoping, and keep believing that tomorrow might be difficult, but it wouldn't be meaningless. And when you finally lay down for the last time, surrounded by family and candlelight and the priest's familiar Latin murmurs, you could hope that all those years of tithing, praying, and patient endurance had earned you something better than what you were leaving behind. It was, perhaps, the most important subscription service ever invented, one that promised delivery to a destination nobody could verify. But everybody needed to believe in: sleep and dreams. The two-act performance night in the medieval countryside wasn't the peaceful, Instagram-worthy experience you might imagine. It wasn't silent in the way modern suburbs are silent, with their gentle hum of air conditioning and distant highway traffic. Medieval night was silent the way a cave is silent, full of creaks, distant sounds, and the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of how loudly your own body exists in the darkness. The day ended when the light failed, which sounds poetic until you realize this meant your productive hours were determined entirely by the sun's schedule. And the sun, frankly, wasn't very considerate about your personal needs or work-life balance. There was no artificial light casually burning through the night. Candles were expensive. Oil lamps were reserved for emergencies or religious devotions. And the concept of staying up late to binge-watch anything was limited to staring at the fire and hoping it wouldn't go out before morning. Most nights, when the fire dimmed to glowing coals, that was your lighting situation until dawn. But here's where medieval sleep gets interesting. People didn't sleep the way we do. They didn't collapse into bed at midnight and wake up 8 hours later feeling refreshed and ready to tackle the day. Instead, they had what historians call segmented sleep, a two-act performance that worked around the reality of long, dark nights. First came first sleep, which began shortly after nightfall. You'd settle into your straw mattress, and yes, it was probably lumpy, shared, and making mysterious rustling sounds, and drift off for 3 or 4 hours. This wasn't a nap, it was legitimate. Deep sleep that your body desperately needed after a day of manual labor that would make modern CrossFit enthusiasts weep. Then, around midnight, you'd wake up. Not because something was wrong, but because this was normal, expected, part of the natural rhythm of medieval life. This wasn't insomnia, it was intermission. During this midnight interval, the world belonged to a different kind of quiet. Some people prayed, not the hurried, distracted prayers of daylight, but the slow, meditative kind that came naturally in the deep darkness. Others stirred the coals, tended the fire, or stepped outside into air so cold it shocked you fully awake and reminded you that winter was not interested in your comfort. Some people use this time for reflection, for processing the day's events, for the kind of deep thinking that's hard to do when you're constantly worried about whether the chickens are safe or the roof is holding. It was like having a built-in meditation period, except meditation wasn't a concept yet, and you were just trying to stay warm while your brain sorted through things. This was also when dreams were most vivid and most remembered. People believed this midnight space opened a thin veil between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the everyday world. If you dreamed during this waking interval, you paid attention to it, because dreams weren't just random brain activity. They were messages, warnings, glimpses of possible futures. Dream interpretation was serious business. A field of wheat might mean prosperity was coming. A snake could indicate illness approaching. A broken tooth often meant death was near, though whose death was usually unclear, which made for some awkward family conversations the next morning. Eventually, my friend, you'd settle back into second sleep, which was often deeper and more restorative than the first. This was the sleep that carried you through until dawn, when the rooster's announcement that morning had arrived would wake you slowly, naturally, without the jarring violence of an alarm clock. Your sleeping arrangements would horrify modern advocates of personal space and bedroom privacy. Everyone slept together, family, relatives, sometimes servants or visitors, all sharing one room because it was the only warm space in the house. Privacy was a luxury that wouldn't be invented for several centuries, along with the radical idea that parents and children might not need to hear each other's every nighttime sound. On the coldest nights, even the animals came inside. A goat near the door, a dog curled by the hearth, chickens in a basket. The medieval approach to heating was simple: gather all available sources of body heat in one location and hope for the best. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survival. You slept in your clothes, not because you lacked nightwear, but because undressing for sleep would have been absurd when you just have to get dressed again in a few hours. And the time between dressed and undressed was time spent being cold. Medieval people had figured out that warmth trumped comfort, and naked was the opposite of warm. The sounds of sleep were communal too. Someone always snored, and someone always did. Because sleep apnea was common and nobody understood why. Someone always shifted, murmured, or talked in their sleep. Children whimpered from dreams or cold. Adults muttered prayers or complaints or fragments of conversations from the day. But there was something comforting about this cacophony of human sounds. You heard your father breathe, your child sob, your grandmother whisper prayers in her sleep. It wasn't peaceful in the modern sense, but it was deeply human. It was shared vulnerability, shared warmth, shared presence in the darkness. The night carried real dangers, both physical and imagined. Wolves in some regions came close enough to the village that their howls raised the hair on your arms. There were thieves, strangers with unclear motives, fires that could start from careless coals, roofs that groaned ominously under snow. And then there were the less explainable things: ghosts, spirits, demons, witches. You didn't discuss them openly during daylight, but everyone knew they were more active at night. The darkness made everything possible, including things you'd rather not think about. To protect against night dangers, both real and supernatural, people followed protective rituals, ironed by the door to ward off evil spirits. The sign of the cross made above the hearth before sleep. Protective herbs, rosemary, sage, rue, hung above entryways. Sometimes a bit of string tied around a child's wrist, just in case. Some families believed that sleep left you vulnerable, that your soul wandered while your body rested, making you susceptible to spiritual attack. So people were careful about sleep positioning. Beds faced toward the fire for warmth and protection. Feet never pointed toward the door because that was how they carried out corpses. When morning finally arrived and the first light crept through the gaps in your shutters, it meant you'd survived another night. You sat up slowly, every joint reminding you of your age, regardless of how young you actually were. You wiped your face, looked around, and mentally counted bodies to make sure everyone who'd gone to sleep was still breathing. The dream you'd had, if it seemed important, was shared with the family over the morning's first meal. Dream interpretation was a community activity, with everyone contributing their understanding of symbols, omens, and possible meanings. Medieval sleep wasn't about comfort or optimal rest cycles or sleep hygiene. It was about endurance, community, and the daily miracle of waking up in a world that offered no guarantees about tomorrow. But somehow, in that shared vulnerability, in that acceptance of discomfort, in that willingness to find rest wherever it could be found, there was a kind of peace. Not the peace of perfect conditions, but the peace of people who had learned to sleep soundly despite imperfect everything, who understood that rest was a gift, that warmth was precious, and that waking up beside the people you loved was worth all the snoring, shifting, and occasional goat noises that came with the arrangement. And perhaps most remarkably, they usually woke up grateful for another day, another chance, another opportunity to face whatever difficulties were waiting outside their door. Because if you could sleep through medieval nights and still wake up hopeful, you were probably strong enough to handle whatever the day decided to throw at you. Disease and plague, the unwelcome guests. Long before the Black Death swept across Europe, and carved itself into history books with the subtlety of a medieval siege engine. Ordinary peasants were already well acquainted with sickness. Disease wasn't a dramatic, once-in-a-lifetime event that historians would write about centuries later. It was more like that annoying neighbor who drops by uninvited, stays too long, and sometimes brings friends. Medieval peasants lived with illness the way modern people live with traffic jams. It was frustrating, occasionally dangerous, and absolutely inevitable. You didn't need a continent-wide catastrophe to be laid low. All it took was a small cut that wouldn't heal, a flea with questionable hygiene habits, or water that looked perfectly clear but had been hosting a microscopic party you definitely weren't invited to. The medieval understanding of disease was like having a weather forecast written by someone who had never been outside. They had theories, confident, elaborate theories, but the connection between theory and reality was often purely coincidental. Some people believed illness was spread by bad air, which led to the medieval equivalent of aromatherapy, stuffing flowers and herbs into your clothing and hoping fragrance could fight off fever. Others were convinced that disease was divine punishment for moral failings, which created a medical system where your doctor's first question wasn't, "What are your symptoms?" but "What have you done to anger God lately?" The prescribed treatment might involve confession, penance, and promising to be a better person if the Almighty would please make the stomach pain stop. There was also the popular theory that illness entered through the soles of your feet, which led to treatments involving boiling your feet or burning things near them. This was medieval medicine's version of, have you tried turning it off and on again? Except instead of rebooting your computer, you were literally boiling your extremities. The most common ailments were the kind that wouldn't make it into dramatic historical accounts, but would absolutely ruin your week. Dysentery, which was like food poisoning's evil older brother. Smallpox, which left survivors looking like they'd been in a fight with a very angry, very small army. Various fevers that came and went without explanation, leaving people weak, confused, and grateful to be alive. And then there were the everyday injuries that could turn life-threatening in a world without antibiotics. A cut from a farming tool, a burn from the cooking fire, a bite from an animal. Any of these could become infected. An infection in medieval times was basically your body's way of saying, we need to have a serious conversation about your life choices. Local wise women were the closest thing most villages had to medical professionals. These were usually older women who had accumulated practical knowledge through decades of trial, error, and the kind of hands-on education you get when people keep bringing you their problems and expecting solutions. They knew which herbs actually work for pain relief, willow bark, which contains the precursor to aspirin, though they didn't know why it worked, just that it did. They understood honey's healing properties for wounds, though they attributed its effectiveness to divine blessing rather than antibacterial action. They could set bones, deliver babies, and provide the kind of practical care that kept communities functional, even when formal medicine was more theory than practice. In other parts of the world, medical knowledge was often more sophisticated. Chinese medicine had developed complex systems of diagnosis and treatment based on energy flow, herbal combinations, and centuries of careful observation. Islamic physicians had preserved and expanded Greek and Roman medical knowledge, developing surgical techniques and pharmaceutical understanding that wouldn't reach Europe for generations. But regardless of the theoretical framework, the daily reality of medieval healthcare was mostly about comfort care, symptom management, and helping people cope with illness rather than curing it. It was palliative medicine before anyone knew to call it that. When someone fell seriously ill, the response was community-based. Neighbors took turns sitting with the sick person, not because there was much they could do medically, but because nobody should face illness alone. They brought soup, the universal medicine that transcends cultural boundaries and actually does help with hydration and nutrition. They shared stories, offered prayers, and provided the kind of emotional support that, while it couldn't cure disease, made the experience of being sick more bearable. Children learned early that life was fragile and health was temporary. They grew up knowing which plants to avoid, which ones to gather for healing, how to clean wounds properly, and how to recognize when someone was seriously ill versus just having a bad day. They also developed the kind of dark humor that comes from living with constant uncertainty. People told stories about ridiculous medical treatments, compared scars like badges of honor, and found ways to laugh about the absurdity of human fragility. Because if you can't find humor in the fact that a tiny invisible organism can fell a strong adult, what can you laugh about? When the Black Death finally did arrive in the 14th century, it didn't introduce the concept of epidemic disease to a naive population. It was more like a terrible amplification of something people already understood. The plague was faster, deadlier, and more widespread than previous diseases. But the basic experience, watching helplessly as illness spread through communities, losing people you loved, wondering if you'd be next, was familiar. The plague came in waves, and each time it returned, people had developed slightly better coping strategies. Not medical treatments, those remained largely ineffective, but social and psychological methods for dealing with mass death. Communities learned how to maintain essential functions when large portions of the population were sick or dead. They developed rationing systems, mutual aid networks, and the kind of grim efficiency that comes from necessity. Some people tried to flee plague outbreaks, but disease travels faster than feet, and often the refugees carried infection to new places. Others turned to extreme religious practices, public whipping, mass prayers, pilgrimages, hoping that dramatic displays of faith might earn divine intervention. A few blamed outsiders and minorities, channeling fear and helplessness into violence against people who were probably just as scared and vulnerable as everyone else. Scapegoating during epidemics was unfortunately not unique to medieval Europe. It's been a depressingly consistent human response to disease throughout history and across cultures. But many people simply endured with the kind of quiet courage that doesn't make it into dramatic historical accounts. They cared for the sick, buried the dead, and continued the essential work of survival. They adapted their daily routines to accommodate the reality of epidemic disease, developing practices that actually did help limit transmission even when they didn't understand the scientific principles involved. They learned to avoid crowded places during outbreaks, to isolate sick family members, to clean contaminated areas, and to maintain social distance before anyone called it that. These weren't based on germ theory, that wouldn't be developed for centuries, but on practical observation of what seemed to help and what seemed to make things worse. Perhaps most remarkably, communities found ways to maintain hope and social cohesion even during the worst outbreaks. They continued to celebrate marriages, births, and religious festivals. Though often in modified forms, they told stories, sang songs, and preserved cultural traditions that gave meaning to survival. The experience of epidemic disease taught medieval people lessons about resilience, community mutual aid, and the importance of maintaining human connections even when human contact was dangerous. They learned that survival often depended less on individual strength than on collective cooperation, and that taking care of each other was both a moral obligation and a practical necessity. Disease was never conquered in the medieval world. It was managed, endured, and incorporated into the rhythm of life. People learned to live with uncertainty, to appreciate health when they had it, and to face illness with whatever combination of medicine, prayer, community support, and stubborn determination they could muster. And somehow, despite everything, life continued. People fell in love, raised children, built homes, and created communities worth living in, even knowing that disease could disrupt everything at any moment. They proved that the human capacity for hope, connection, and meaning-making is stronger than any epidemic, which might be the most important medical discovery of all. Resistance and rebellion, the art of quiet defiance. You might think that after everything medieval peasants endured, the famines that made their stomachs echo like empty barrels, the plagues that swept through villages like deadly gossip, the taxes that took everything except their ability to complain about taxes, they would have risen up more often. That all that accumulated suffering would have eventually reached a breaking point where ordinary people grabbed their farming tools and decided they had had quite enough of this feudal nonsense. Thank you very much. And you'd be right to think that there were revolts. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, the Jacquerie in France a few decades earlier. Scattered uprisings across Europe like sparks from a badly tended fire. Angry voices in places where the lords had pushed too hard, taken too much, or made one demand too many from people who had nothing left to give. Sometimes the spark caught fire. A tax collector's house might burn. A particularly unpopular steward might find himself escorted out of town by an angry crowd. A banner might be raised, speeches made, demands shouted at castle walls that had never heard such language from the people who'd built them. But these fires burned fast and were usually snuffed out even faster. They ended in executions, in gallows built in village squares, in silences heavier than the ones that came before. The world didn't change. The grain still needed to be planted, and someone still needed to plant it. So why didn't peasants revolt more often? The answer isn't that they were cowardly or stupid or naturally submissive. Medieval peasants were none of those things. They were survivors, and survivors understand mathematics in ways that don't require formal education. The math was simple. Revolution required time, energy, and resources that most people needed for the daily business of not dying. You could spend your day planning an uprising, or you could spend it ensuring your family had something to eat tonight. You couldn't do both, and one of those choices had immediate, visible consequences. The system worked, not because it was fair or kind or anything approaching just, but because it was predictable. It had rules, harsh but consistent, but you knew what you owed, you knew what was expected, and you knew what would happen if you failed to meet those expectations. You could plan around injustice if it was reliable injustice, but to say peasants didn't resist would be completely wrong. They just did it differently, in ways that wouldn't get them hanged, but might make their lives slightly more bearable. Their resistance was like water wearing away stone, patient, persistent, and ultimately effective. Even if you couldn't see the results immediately, they practiced what we might call everyday resistance. Small acts of defiance that flew under the radar of official attention. A pig kept off the tax rolls. An extra sack of grain buried in the woods before the steward came to count. Information shared about when officials would be visiting, giving people time to hide their better possessions. They told jokes about their lords, not in public, not where it could be reported, but around fires at night, in fields during harvest, in the kind of whispered conversations that built solidarity through shared irreverence. Medieval humor was like modern memes, except the content was, Lord Geoffrey fell off his horse again, and did you hear about the steward who couldn't count past 10 without taking off his shoes? They sang songs with double meanings, where on the surface they were singing about farming or love or religious devotion. But underneath, they were commenting on the absurdity of their situation. They developed a culture of veiled criticism that let them express frustration without technically committing treason. They also became masters of selective compliance, following the letter of the law while completely ignoring its spirit. If they were required to provide a chicken for tax, they'd provide the scrawniest, most pathetic chicken in the village. If they owed labor service, they'd work slowly, take frequent breaks, and somehow manage to be less productive than usual. This wasn't laziness, it was strategic incompetence, the kind of careful underperformance that's hard to punish because technically the work was being done, just not very well. It was a form of protest that required no organizing, no meetings, no leaders who could be arrested and made examples of. The church, despite being part of the power structure, also provided opportunities for resistance. Religious festivals created spaces where normal social hierarchies were temporarily suspended. During certain celebrations, peasants could mock authority figures, make satirical speeches, and generally blow off steam in ways that would be unthinkable during regular times. Pilgrimages offered legitimate reasons to leave the manor, to travel, to see other places and hear about how things were done elsewhere. Information traveled along pilgrimage routes like medieval social networking. letting people compare their situations and realize that some lords were worse than others, some systems more oppressive. Even religious language could be turned into resistance. Biblical stories about the powerful being brought low, about justice for the oppressed, about the meek inheriting the earth. These weren't just spiritual comfort, they were coded political commentary. When peasants sang hymns about divine justice, they weren't just thinking about the afterlife. The most effective form of resistance, though, was simply continuing to exist, surviving despite everything the system threw at them, maintaining families, communities, traditions, and dignity in the face of constant pressure. This wasn't passive endurance, it was active preservation of humanity in an inhumane system. They kept alive songs, stories, and customs that weren't written down anywhere, passing them from generation to generation through memory and practice. They maintained knowledge about healing, farming, craftsmanship, and community organization that didn't depend on official institutions. They created parallel economies based on mutual aid, gift exchange, and reciprocal obligation that operated alongside but separate from the official feudal economy. When the harvest failed, neighbors shared food. When someone's house collapsed, the community helped rebuild it. When children were orphaned, families took them in. This network of informal support was a form of resistance to the system's basic premise that people were only valuable for what they could produce for their lords. It insisted that human beings had worth independent of their economic utility, and that communities could take care of their own members regardless of what official authorities did or didn't provide. Women, in particular, developed forms of resistance that were nearly invisible to male authorities. They controlled information networks, managed household resources, and made countless small decisions that could make the difference between survival and disaster. They taught children which officials to trust and which to avoid, how to hide valuable items, and when to speak and when to stay silent. The ultimate act of peasant resistance was cultural persistence. Despite everything, they maintained their own values, their own sense of humor, their own ways of understanding the world. They refused to accept that their suffering was natural or inevitable, even when they couldn't do much to change it immediately. They told their children the stories about better times and better rulers. They preserved memories of local autonomy, of fairer treatment, of times when communities had more control over their own affairs. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were evidence that current conditions weren't permanent, that change was possible. When major revolts did occur, they drew on this foundation of everyday resistance, this network of shared understanding and mutual support. The peasants who rose up in 1381 weren't acting spontaneously. They were drawing on generations of quiet preparation, of community building, of patient accumulation of grievances and dreams. Most of these revolts failed in their immediate goals, but they succeeded in something more important. They proved that ordinary people could organize, could articulate demands, could challenge authority when pushed too far. They established precedents and created memories that would inspire future generations. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that peasants weren't just victims of history, they were participants in it. They might not have written the rules, but they found ways to influence how those rules were applied. They might not have owned the land, but they shaped how it was used. They might not have held formal power, but they exercised informal influence in countless small ways. Their resistance was like underground streams, mostly invisible from the surface, but constantly flowing, constantly reshaping the landscape in small ways that eventually add up to significant change. It was the kind of resistance that doesn't make dramatic headlines, but gradually makes life more bearable, communities stronger, and oppression less total. And maybe that's the most revolutionary thing of all, the quiet insistence that despite everything, human dignity is worth preserving, community is worth maintaining, and hope is worth keeping alive, even when the odds seem impossible. Travel in the outside world, beyond the horizon. For most medieval peasants, the world effectively ended where their knowledge ended, which was usually somewhere around the next hill over. This wasn't because they lacked curiosity or wanderlust. It was because travel was like playing Russian roulette, except instead of one bullet in 6 chambers, it was more like 5 bullets and maybe a snail. The medieval GPS system consisted of helpful directions like, go until you see the leaning pine tree, then turn left at the stone that looks like a sleeping pig. And if you reach the place where 3 paths meet and there's a smell like rotting fish, you've gone too far. This navigation method had roughly the same accuracy rate as throwing darts while blindfolded. Most people lived their entire lives within a 5-mile radius of where they were born. Not because they were afraid of adventure, but because adventure had a tendency to be fatal. The road to the next village might only be 5 miles, but those 5 miles could include bandits, wolves, getting spectacularly lost, dying of exposure, falling into bogs, or meeting people who spoke a slightly different dialect and were therefore potentially hostile. Medieval roads weren't the well-maintained highways we imagine from movies. They were mostly muddy tracks through forests and fields, marked by the deep ruts left by ox carts and the occasional pile of bones from travelers who'd made poor navigation decisions. There were no road signs, no rest stops, no AAA to call when your cartwheel broke in the middle of nowhere. If you did decide to travel, you had to answer some uncomfortable questions first. Who would tend your animals while you were gone? Who would watch your children? What if the Lord's steward came around to collect taxes while you were away? And most importantly, what if you never made it back? The answers to these questions were usually nobody. They'll have to fend for themselves. You'd be in serious trouble. Your family would never know what happened to you. This made travel seem less like an adventure and more like an elaborate form of suicide with extra steps. But people did travel sometimes, usually because they had no choice or because they'd reached the point where staying home seemed more dangerous than leaving. Merchants traveled because commerce required it, and they traveled in groups with guards and weapons and the kind of paranoid awareness that comes from knowing everyone you meet might be planning to rob you. Monks and clergy traveled on church business, protected by religious authority and the general medieval reluctance to murder representatives of God, though this protection was more theoretical than absolute. Pilgrims traveled for spiritual reasons, believing that the journey itself was part of the cure for whatever ailed them, whether that was physical illness, spiritual crisis, or just really terrible luck. For most peasants, the only legitimate reason to travel was pilgrimage, which was like getting a hall pass from the feudal system. You could leave your lord's land, walk hundreds of miles, and visit holy sites without technically abandoning your obligations, because you were doing it for God. And everyone agreed that God outranked earthly lords. Pilgrimage was part spiritual journey, part vacation, part endurance test, and part social networking opportunity. You met people from other places, heard stories about different ways of living, and discovered that your particular form of medieval misery wasn't the only option available. The Canterbury Tales gives us a glimpse of medieval travel as social experience. People from different backgrounds thrown together by circumstance, sharing stories to pass the time and make the journey more bearable. These traveling communities formed temporary bonds that could last long after everyone had returned home. For those who couldn't or wouldn't travel, information about the outside world came secondhand through merchants, pilgrims, and the occasional refugee fleeing from some distant disaster. These stories were received with the kind of fascination reserved for tales from another planet. You might hear about cities where buildings reached impossible heights of 3 or even 4 stories, where people bought food instead of growing it, where strangers walked the streets without anyone asking who their parents were or why they weren't home working in the fields. These urban legends were simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. Cities sounded like magical places where anything was possible, but they also sounded like chaos. Too many people, too much noise, too many opportunities for everything to go wrong at once. The few peasants who did make it to cities often returned with stories that seemed too strange to be true. Streets paved with stones instead of mud. Shops that sold only one type of thing. People whose only job was making shoes or baking bread or copying books. Water that came from wells instead of rivers. Buildings so tall you had to crane your neck to see the top. But even the most amazing travel stories were filtered through the practical concerns of peasant life. The question wasn't what wonders did you see, but did you learn anything useful? Any better ways to preserve food? New techniques for fixing tools? Information about weather patterns or crop diseases? Travel, for peasants, was always measured against the cost of leaving home and the value of what you might learn. Most of the time, the math didn't work out in favor of adventure. Besides, home had its own attractions. You knew where the good water was, which neighbors could be trusted, how to read the local weather signs, and where to find food in lean times. You understood the local dialect, customs, and the complex social relationships that made community life possible. Leaving meant giving up all that accumulated knowledge and starting over in a place where you'd be a stranger, possibly unwelcome, definitely vulnerable. It meant trading the known for the unknown, and the unknown was vast, mysterious, and probably full of people who wanted to take advantage of naive travelers. So most peasants stayed home, but that didn't mean they weren't curious about what lay beyond their horizons. They developed rich imaginative lives, creating mental maps of places they'd never seen based on fragments of stories, rumors, and wishful thinking. They dreamed of visiting the Holy Land, seeing the great cathedrals, walking streets where saints had walked. They imagined what it would be like to live in a place where winter was shorter, food was more plentiful, or lords were kinder. These dreams weren't plans, they were comfort, a way of expanding their world without leaving the safety of what they knew. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the ability to imagine other possibilities, other ways of living, other landscapes and communities, was itself a form of travel. Perhaps the real journey was the mental one that allowed people to remain hopeful about the world beyond their immediate experience, even when they'd never see it for themselves. In the end, the outside world remained mostly theoretical for medieval peasants, a collection of stories, rumors, and dreams that made their own small world feel slightly less isolated. But knowing it existed, knowing there were other places and other people facing similar challenges, was its own kind of comfort. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was adventure enough. Seasons and time, the medieval calendar. If you asked a medieval peasant what time it was, they wouldn't check their wrist or pull out a phone. They'd look at the sky, squint at the shadows, and tell you something like, past dinner but before evening prayers, or when the sun touches the top of the oak tree. Time wasn't numbers on a clock face, it was the rhythm of daily survival, marked by the needs of animals, the position of shadows, and the eternal question of whether there was enough daylight left to finish whatever desperately needed finishing. Medieval people didn't organize their lives around artificial schedules imposed by distant authorities who'd never milked a cow or harvested grain. They lived according to what historians romantically called natural time, and what peasants probably called the time when stuff needs to get done, whether you're ready or not. The agricultural calendar was the real organizing principle of peasant life, and it was written not in books, but in the behavior of plants, animals, and weather. Spring wasn't March 20th on some arbitrary calendar. It was when the ground softened enough to plow, when buds appeared on trees, when chickens started laying more eggs and acting less like depressed, feathered lumps. Summer wasn't about vacation time or beach weather. It was about desperately long days of trying to grow enough food to survive the next winter, knowing that every day of sunshine was precious and every rainstorm could either save your crops or destroy them, depending on timing, intensity, and the apparent mood of whatever deity controlled agricultural outcomes. Autumn wasn't about pretty leaves and pumpkin spice. It was about the terrifying mathematics of harvest, adding up what you'd grown, subtracting what you owed in taxes and tithes, calculating what you needed to save for seed, and hoping the remainder would keep your family alive until spring decided to return. Winter was survival mode, pure and simple, a time when the smart planning of the previous 3 seasons was tested against the reality of cold, hunger, and the human body's stubborn insistence on needing food and warmth to continue functioning. But the church had its own ideas about how time should be organized. And medieval peasants found themselves living according to two overlapping calendars that didn't always agree with each other. The agricultural calendar said, harvest when the grain is ready, while the church calendar said, but also remember that tomorrow is St. Crispin's feast day, so you'll need to stop working and attend Mass. This created interesting negotiations between practical necessity and religious obligation. You couldn't tell your wheat to wait for the holy day to be over before it became overripe. But you also couldn't tell the priest that God would have to understand about the harvest schedule. The church calendar was impressively comprehensive, dividing the year into sacred seasons that determined not just when you prayed, but what you ate, when you worked, and how guilty you should feel about enjoying yourself. Lent meant 40 days of pretending you weren't desperately craving meat while surviving on whatever fish you could catch or afford. Advent meant preparing for Christmas with the kind of anticipation that comes from knowing you'll finally get to eat something other than turnip soup. Saints' days provided the medieval equivalent of public holidays, except instead of getting a 3-day weekend, you got a day off from work obligations and maybe slightly better food if your family could afford it. These feast days were scattered throughout the year like treats in a very austere Advent calendar, giving people something to look forward to during the long stretches of ordinary survival. People didn't celebrate birthdays because most people didn't know exactly when they were born, and age was measured more by capability than calendar years. You weren't 35 years old. You were old enough to remember the bad harvest 3 years after the great storm, or young enough to still climb trees but old enough to know better. This created a different relationship with aging and mortality. You didn't dread turning another year older because you weren't counting years the same way. You measured your life in harvests. Winters survived, children raised, and skills mastered. The changing seasons provided natural rhythm and meaning to life in ways that our climate-controlled, artificially lit world sometimes lacks. People were deeply attuned to subtle changes in daylight, temperature, and weather patterns because their survival depended on reading these signs accurately. They knew which birds returned when, which plants bloomed first, which clouds meant rain, and which meant frost. They could predict weather with the accuracy of experienced meteorologists because they'd spent their entire lives watching the sky and learning from their mistakes. This intimate knowledge of natural cycles created a sense of being embedded in something larger than human concerns, not just spiritually, through religious observance, but practically, through daily dependence on natural processes that couldn't be controlled or hurried. There was both comfort and anxiety in this arrangement. Comfort in the predictability of seasonal change, the reliable return of spring after winter, the knowledge that some things remain constant even when human affairs were chaotic. Anxiety in the complete dependence on weather, the inability to control or predict the natural forces that determined whether your family would eat well or barely survive. But perhaps most importantly, this seasonal organization of time created built-in periods of rest, reflection, and celebration. Winter forced people to slow down, to gather around fires, to tell stories and maintain the social bonds that would be essential for community survival. Harvest time brought celebrations that were both thanksgiving for successful crops and stress relief after months of anxious labor. Even the church calendar, for all its demands and restrictions, provided rhythm and variety to what could otherwise have been an unrelenting cycle of work and worry. Saints' days, religious festivals, and seasonal observances created breaks in routine, opportunities for community gathering, and legitimate reasons to hope for something better than ordinary daily life. Medieval peasants may not have had clocks, but they had something perhaps more valuable: a deep understanding of natural time, seasonal rhythm, and the patient wisdom that comes from living according to the cycles larger and older than any individual human life. They knew that winter always ended, that seeds planted in spring would grow in summer, that hard work during harvest could mean survival through the cold months ahead. This knowledge didn't make their lives easy, but it gave them a framework for understanding hardship as temporary and hope as reasonable. In our age of artificial schedules and disconnection from natural cycles, there's something almost enviable about that deep integration with the rhythm of seasons, the patient acceptance of natural timing, and the community celebrations that marked the turning of the year, even if it did come with the minor inconvenience of occasionally starving to death when the timing went wrong. The quiet heroes. So here we are, at the end of our gentle journey through the medieval countryside, having spent these quiet hours in the company of people who lived lives so different from ours that they might as well have been from another planet. And yet, somehow, they feel remarkably familiar. These peasants we've been visiting, the ones who woke up before dawn to milk cows that had opinions about schedules, who ate the same soup for months while calling it by different names to maintain morale, who slept in beds shared with half their family and occasionally a confused goat, they weren't so different from us. Really, Pui, they worried about money, though they called it grain and eggs, and whether the harvest would be enough. They dealt with difficult neighbors, unreasonable bosses, and the eternal challenge of trying to raise children in a world that seemed designed to make parenting as stressful as humanly possible. They had relationship drama, work stress, health anxiety, and the constant low-level worry that comes from never being entirely sure what tomorrow might bring. They told jokes, fell in love, got frustrated with bureaucracy, and occasionally lay awake at night wondering if they were doing anything right. The main difference between their lives and ours wasn't that they were more patient, more accepting, or more spiritually advanced. It's that they figured out how to find meaning, community, and even happiness within constraints that would probably break most of us within a week. They didn't have Netflix, smartphones, or pizza delivery. They didn't have central heating, indoor plumbing, or access to the accumulated knowledge of human civilization at their fingertips. What they had instead was something we sometimes struggle to find in our age of infinite options, the ability to be content with enough. They knew how to appreciate small comforts because small comforts were all they had. A fire that stayed lit through the night, a meal that filled the belly, a roof that mostly kept out the rain, a neighbor who shared bread when times were hard, a child who survived to adulthood, a day when nobody died of anything preventable. These weren't people who had given up on dreams or ambitions. They were people who had learned to find the extraordinary within the ordinary, the meaningful within the mundane, the precious within the simple. They understood something we're still trying to figure out, that survival itself can be a form of success, that endurance can be elegant, and that the quiet acts of daily love, sharing food, tending the sick, teaching children, maintaining community, are actually the most important work any human being can do. When we started this journey, we talked about medieval peasants as people without glory, without legacy, without names recorded in history books. But that's not quite right, is it? Their legacy is everywhere, Sarah. It's in every community that takes care of its vulnerable members. It's in every family that prioritizes togetherness over individual achievement. It's in every person who finds a way to laugh in difficult circumstances. Their legacy is in the knowledge that ordinary people can endure extraordinary hardship and still maintain their humanity. That communities can function without perfect conditions or ideal leadership. That it's possible to find joy in small things, meaning in simple work, and hope in uncertain circumstances. They prove that the human capacity for love, humor, creativity, and mutual support is stronger than any feudal system. Any epidemic, any famine or flood or plague of locusts, they demonstrated that happiness doesn't require perfect conditions. It requires people who are willing to create it together, using whatever materials are available. The world they built with their hands, the fields they plowed, the houses they constructed, the communities they nurtured, became the foundation for everything that came after. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the modern world we live in today, all of it was built on the accumulated work of people whose names we'll never know, but whose contributions made everything else possible. They were the quiet heroes of human history, not the ones who conquered kingdoms, but the ones who made sure there were kingdoms worth conquering. Not the ones who built monuments, but the ones who built the societies that could afford to build monuments. Not the ones who wrote epic poems, but the ones who lived epic lives. One ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. And now, as you lie in your comfortable bed with your soft sheets and your reliable roof and your reasonable certainty that tomorrow will be much like today, you might spare a thought for those medieval peasants, the ones who would probably find our problems amusing and our solutions unnecessarily complicated. The ones who knew that a warm fire, a full belly, and a peaceful night's sleep were achievements worth celebrating. Who understood that the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to give up? Who proved that it's possible to sleep soundly even when everything is uncertain? As long as you're surrounded by people who care about you, they would probably tell you to stop worrying so much about things you can't control, to appreciate what you have while you have it, to remember that most problems are temporary, most pain is survivable, and most days are better than they seem when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning creating elaborate disaster scenarios in your head. They might remind you that humans have been figuring out how to live together, take care of each other, and find meaning in difficult circumstances for thousands of years. That you're descended from an unbroken line of survivors, people who faced impossible odds and somehow made it through to have children who made it through to have children who eventually, against all probability, led to you. And that if they could find a way to sleep peacefully in beds made of straw, in rooms shared with livestock, in a world that offered no guarantees about anything, maybe you can find a way to rest easy too. So take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, feel grateful for the warmth, the safety, the abundance that surrounds you. And remember that somewhere out there in the quiet corners of history, a medieval peasant is nodding approvingly and saying, "Yes, that's exactly right. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Sweet dreams."